afternoon, everyone. We'll start by introducing ourselves and then kind of give an overview of today's workshop on bilingualism and learning across the disciplines. My name is Erika. I'm a faculty member in the College of Education. I'm associate professor of literacy by literacy education and co-chair of the Department of Teacher Education.
Martine Ceberio. I'm an associate professor of computer science, so in engineering.
My name is Alberto Esquinca. I'm also in the College of Education, Teacher Education, and I do work in bilingual at ASL.
So thank you for taking the time to come here today to this workshop. Being that we're bringing this educational perspective, this is not going to be a sit and get workshop, or it's not going to be us up here talking the entire time. It will be interactive, not going to get ready. We're going to meet people, just because we know that we learn best when we're interacting with one another and with content. So this is going to be an overview of working with bilingual students across the disciplines. We want to emphasize that it's just meant to be sort of scratching the surface. There's a lot of good research and practice that's being done on working with bilingual students and English language learners at the college level. So there's and at the K-12 level. So there's a lot to draw on, and this is just the tip of we're just sort of scratching the surface here in today's workshop. We also know that, like Mark said, there's a lot of expertise that exists across campus. There's a lot of expertise that you all bring to working with the students that we have here at UTEP. So part of the interactiveness of the workshop will also be drawing on your expertise as well. All right, so in the spirit of getting to know one another and finding out sort of who's here, so I know everybody's still eating, but if you could just take a minute to find a partner, a person to talk to, or maybe a group of three, introduce yourselves, where you're coming from, what program or department or unit you're coming from, and if you're teaching, these are innovative teaching workshops, so we made some assumptions, but you may not be teaching right now, and that's okay too, but if you are teaching, what you teach. So if you could introduce yourself to the partners, and then we'll go around and do introductions, and here you'll introduce your partner to the rest of the group. We'll do it fairly quickly. A great representation here from across campus, everything from languages and linguistics to biology, kids in the back, the pharmacy school, theater. We've just got a great representation from across campus, and we're excited that you all are here and excited that you're interested in this topic of working with bilingual students. So as I mentioned earlier, this is going to be interactive, so we're going to start off with a little bit of writing and talking while you're finishing up eating, and then we're going to move into talking a little bit about we're going to start off with a think, pair, share kind of activity, and then we're going to move into talking a little bit about some myths around bilingualism and bilingual students and English learner students, and then we're going to get into the kind of nuts and bolts, just some examples of classroom strategies. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but some classroom strategies that we've implemented in our own classrooms that could be effective in different subject areas and different disciplines. And so within each of these, we'll also have a chance to talk and interact with each other around the content. All right.
This is going to be interactive. We really want to hear from you. And before we tell you things that we do in our classroom, we'd like to know what your experience has been working with bilingual students. And also what drew you to this workshop. We're curious. We're really, that's going to get us an idea of what you do. From what I learned before, what I heard, I think we're going to learn also a lot today. And we want to know what you'd like to get out of this workshop. So why did you come? So why don't you take a few minutes? You have index cards on your table, so we distributed them, so they should be not too far from you. Side one, just to give it some shape. Side one, what's been your experience, and then side two, what brought you to this workshop. So take a few minutes to do this, and then share it with your partner or any partner. You can mix however you want.
I was telling Suzanne that what I do sometimes is I'm not a fluent Spanish speaker, and I wish I were. And sometimes I will try in my classroom to speak in Spanish. And so when my students come to me and they say, oh, I can't speak Spanish, I don't speak English very well, I will say, well, you know what, your English is bad. You know, so
But
don't
they
feel
like they
bad.
encourage.
You know, I just want them to feel safe.
Yeah, so I wrote that my experience working with bilingual students has been really great. As a language teacher, I can really draw on the rich language repertoire that the students bring, and it's really been an excellent experience. I have no complaints.
Alright, so we're gonna just kind of talk about a few different myths, again, scratching the surface, right, and thinking about bilingualism and working with bilingual students. But one is that bilingualism is an individual set of skills only learned in the head. We're saying that this is a myth, right? We know from language socialization theory that we learn language in context. We learn language by interacting with others and speaking the language, so this learning by doing, right? And so that has a lot of implications for our own classrooms. If we're thinking about our classrooms as sites for language learning, and I know it doesn't seem like it, but yes, you know, our college students at all levels, undergraduate, master's, and doctoral, are engaged in language learning. Even if they are born, they've spoken English their entire lives, they're still learning the disciplinary language of the different subjects that everyone here teaches. So, and then our bilingual students are working on their academic forms of English and the disciplinary forms of English as well. And so our classrooms are those spaces in which they're going to learn and develop their specialized language. In most cases in English, even though there are some instances of some classes on campus, across campus, that are offered in Spanish as well. And so that's really important, and something that's connected to this too, and it's going to be built on in other points too, is that because language is learned in context, competence is also contingent on the context. So evaluating somebody's competence is dependent on what context they're doing the language in. We'll talk more about that in a minute.
So another myth that we are familiar with from the literature is this idea that there's something called a real bilingual, right? So real bilingual that equals two monolinguals in one, right? This idea that you have to be, you can divide people in terms of how proficient they are in both languages, and so that you're comparing bilingual to monolinguals, right? You're not comparing bilingual to other bilinguals, but you're comparing it to two people, right? So that means that this idea, we can see it, some repercussions of this idea when we listen to the thing about evaluating negatively what bilinguals do. So things like mixing languages or translating are seen as negative because that goes against this division of the two in one, right? So it's a myth because, like Erika was saying, we gain competence in our social worlds, in social interactions, right? So bilinguals develop some proficiencies based on their experiences with other people, right? In particular domains, right? And so, of course, this image comes from Cummins. Jim Cummins told us, well, there's not two separate proficiencies. There's one underlying proficiency that's expressed in more than one language. Okay, so related to that is this idea of linguistic purism, right? Evaluations about what people do with their languages, right? So that, interestingly, at the beginning of the 20th century, these ideas that true bilinguals were people who didn't mix, right? So, and the studies that they drew on were studies that were being done with low-income immigrant populations. So based on those studies, people said, well, look at how these bilinguals are using languages. So they're mixed, they're mentally confused, they can't keep their languages straight. So we can see these ideas still, there's repercussions, right? So because we're judging these linguistic practices based on a limited source of data, of evidence, right? So, but when we consider the full range of the full repertoire that bilingual and multilingual people bring, we can start to appreciate it in terms of assets rather than deficits, right? And so we can see these linguistic purist ideologies expressed especially here, right? So this idea of border Spanish, border English, both bad, right? So that you have to, some researchers and ourselves have questioned these ideologies, right? And seen them as what they are.
The last myth that we want to talk about is about oral and written language competence that can be equated to intelligence and content knowledge. So we have bilingual students, and just like was said before, we tend to compare them to, so when they talk to us in one language, we tend to compare them to monolingual students, and we expect them to have this level of competency. Now, we do evaluate competence and content knowledge in our classes, but we have to be very careful not to fall into this, because, well, I'm a computer scientist, so I don't expect my students to write a lot of essays. So I may not have to evaluate their competence in English, for instance, very often, but I do for master's or dissertations manuscripts. It's really very important not to confuse the way content is exposed with the content itself. Now, that's a myth, because this is something that unfortunately we've heard. We've seen people being treated not, I would say, fairly based on what we knew of their content knowledge compared to the way it was exposed. So the way it's exposed is how people will express it in either of the language, which, well, with me, usually it's English. But yeah, that's unfortunately a myth. We tend to judge people, to assess people on their ability to communicate in the language that they are using at that time, as assessed against a monolingual native in one language, and basically kind of stop at this barrier of, oh, grammar is not good, vocabulary is not good, so content cannot be good. So that's really important to mention as a myth, and something to really refrain from. I don't know, want to believe nobody does it here, but maybe try to identify as well. If you see something like this happening around you, this is a conversation to be had.
So now what we'd like to do is hear from you all just what myths that these are just, again, sort of a few that we hear circulating quite a bit, but maybe what other myths we'd like for you to talk with your small groups or your partner about other myths about bilingualism that you've come across, but then also, really importantly, how these affect our students and how we can transform them in the classroom. So this is where, as instructors, as teachers, as faculty members, we have a chance to make a change in terms of how we think about our bilingual students and our English learner students in the classroom. So just in pairs, and then I just want to say at the end, we're going to talk about, we're going to go into talking about sort of the nuts and bolts, hands-on strategies, and we want to hear from you also about the strategies that you already engage in with your bilingual students. And I've already heard a few. I know that there's some good ones out there. So this is right now talking about the myths or the beliefs that we have about students, or the beliefs that you hear about with our bilingual students. So go ahead in your pairs or small groups.
She was mentioning that Spanish sometimes is not viewed as an academic language or a language of research, and that this is hugely problematic, right? Because there's a language prioritization that's happening, which is the language of intelligence, which is the language of a higher socioeconomic standing, and these sorts of things. And her efforts to break that down by doing reading in English and Spanish, by having the students read scholarship in English and Spanish both, so that they could understand quickly that that is simply not the case.
Yeah, just working to give a platform for Spanish speakers to know that there is that. Because a lot of my students, bilingual students, have a very, what I would call familiar competence in Spanish. So, like, they can, they are used to talking in more kind of like, kind of social, friendly, familiar context. And they haven't been exposed so much to academic Spanish. And so I'm totally bilingual, totally fluid. I mean, I'm trilingual, but I totally mix and match. And all my classes, I encourage them to talk in Spanish, in English, and I try to give scholarship in both languages. I think it's super important for them to know that there are a lot of publication in Spanish. There's a validity to Spanish.
We both actually work with Centro de Salud Familiar La Fe.
Okay.
And
I'm
we
sorry,
also have
say that again, you work with,
the Centro de Salud Familiar La Fe clinic.
okay.
And they also have schools, prep school. And so they have that. So
Right.
they teach the children in Spanish or the English, and in Spanish, and they alternate. So by the time that they're finished, they converse properly in both languages.
What he said from the perspective of the students, they often group together in language communities in the classroom when they're studying or when they're doing activities. And so he said, is it because they don't think they're proficient enough to work with students who are not bilingual, or is it a comfort issue? They just feel like it's better to stick to someone who speaks Spanish and can help them identify the concept better. And so,
I hear what you're saying. It reminds me of this idea of how language is used as a sign of identity, right? So then maybe that's a part of the identity piece there, that maybe they see each other with these peers, and so they want to feel welcome, right? So perhaps there's an opportunity also to talk about how language can be a way to build bridges, right? So maybe if somebody doesn't understand both languages, maybe bring them in and help them to learn some of the Spanish terms too, so why not?
well, I have a class of 30, but he has a class of 130, so that's a big difference.
Yeah, that's,
So,
of course, context matters, and I agree.
yeah.
I agree.
I was like, well, I do grouping, and he said, well, I have 130.
And so you do grouping in the large class?
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't purposely create groups. I let them self-sort because most of our classes are in like the stadium seating.
Right.
It's hard to organize people anyway. But yeah, I have them self-sort and work usually in.
So it's who they're sitting with.
Right.
It's kind of like here, right?
Exactly.
We didn't count off or make everybody get in different places or like, where's the... And we're going to talk about that later too. We'll talk about that actually as a strategy, maybe not even as a deficiency, but really something that when they're sitting and talking in their language of choice with peers, maybe they're all speaking in Spanish about whatever the concept is, that actually can be a way of making sense of the content and working with that common underlying proficiency, right? Where one of the earlier slides, where they're moving across, their content knowledge across both languages. All right, that's a really great point. Any other myths that you talked about? Yes?
Does it have to be classroom related?
And I don't think so. I think right now we're talking in general terms about how we talk about bilingualism and bilingual speakers and students.
So we were discussing like when people equate accents to how proficient you are in a language. So case in point, like my dad, we're from Jamaica, so his accent's very strong, and he's at work and somebody calls and they're like, can I speak to someone who speaks English? But our first language there is English. So my dad's like, I speak perfect English. You don't understand my accent. And so it's just a very common myth where people hear the accent and they're like, speak English. But they are speaking English. They speak it better than usual. Pretty funny.
That's a really good.
We talked a lot about that.
Well, yeah, obviously I ran into this problem too. So yeah, when we were preparing the workshop, we talked about that because I see sometimes I'm dismissed based on, oh, we don't understand, or that made me more sensitive about how to approach my students in this question, definitely.
And we talked about it too, like a kind of building on what you're saying about as an identity marker. So accents are a marker of identity, but sometimes, and this is a myth, not a reality, but people perceive it as a marker of intelligence, right? Which is really problematic. And a lot of you might just put that out there. It's really problematic to see accents, and Spanish is my second language. I learned it as an adult. I will always have an accent in Spanish, and I can tell when I have some interactions in Mexico that people are like, you don't know what you're talking about, And that I think that's what we're talking about here, sort of what just accents themselves can be so distracting when we get focused on the phonology, the way something sounds, rather than the content of what whoever it is saying. And so I think that's a really great point. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, and if I may add, it's important to create a safe place because then there are all sorts of stereotype threats that play. So for me, speaking of my experience, obviously I have done of that. If I know that I'm with someone who expects me not to speak well, I will speak even worse than usual. And sometimes as being dismissed, so there are some words that I learned when I learned English that are not particularly used here. And I found sometimes using them that people were dismissing me, like, you don't know how to speak English, this is obviously not an English word. And I was thinking to myself, well, actually, yes, it is. So now I learned my lesson. And I try to use, detours to kind of use the definition of the word instead of the word or another word that I know is more used here. But this is the everyday life of our students, I think. So those are problems that they run into. So reflecting on our own experience, because even though, so obviously I speak another language than my native language every day, but I'm sure that most of us know another language. So think of when you use this other language and what happens, just kind of to put yourself in the shoes of your students. So.
What about how we can transform? Did anyone talk about how we can transform negative beliefs around language? Did you not get that far? Too heavy of a question? Did anyone else want to share anything that you talked about? Or we can keep going. Okay.
Well,
Last comment.
something we discussed is, especially for us at least, in pharmacy especially, or in healthcare,
Right.
having multiple languages is a strength. So when someone's bilingual, like, yes, that's great, that's okay, we need you, you know? And so it's like the more languages you can learn, the better off you are.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the flip side of it, and that's why we're trying to use it in the School of Pharmacy to prepare students so that they can speak Spanish and English and to different health literacy levels. So.
And is that a message that's coming from the school itself? Or is that something that you hear? Is that
Yeah,
it's been
it's
collectively
pharmacy,
agreed upon by faculty, by staff? Like,
Probably spend more on that.
no, I mean that's very powerful. Is what,
We try to rely on our, I think that's something that UTEP kind of supports in general, and
Right.
I know the School of Pharmacy is really focused on getting that message out to faculty.
Yeah. So as part of the larger university, but specifically within.
I know for
pharmacy.
the PT program, I'm working on a grant with the director of the physical therapy program. For them, it's about safety. If you are bilingual, but what's your proficiency level so that the information you're giving to the client is safe, that you're giving accurate information. And so in healthcare, I think that's been a big issue of language and safety for a patient or caregiver or client.
That makes a lot of sense. The lives are at stake.
Yeah.
Medicine, and we're talking about, that's, yeah, all right. Well, thank you all. Oh, good.
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to mention is that I've met people in this community who come from Hispanic backgrounds and maybe from a different generation, but they were actually discouraged to
Right.
speak Spanish.
That's correct.
Despite of the accessibility that they have from their family members
Right.
to actually speak it, and it was at the end detrimental to them by not utilizing those resources. So nowadays, the transformation would be to actually encourage to use the available resources and to speak both languages since an early age.
I think it's so great that you brought that up. I mean, there's a really not pretty history around, especially in the Southwest, right?
Public
Around
school, yeah.
bilingualism in the schools and students getting punished for speaking Spanish. And so, so I think that's a really great, and hopefully we're in a different era. And when I look around at colleagues at UTEP or I hear what you all are saying in here, I'm so encouraged that we're in a different era, but then if I go home to Virginia or if I sometimes listen to NPR, I'm not as encouraged. So we're still up against some pretty strong beliefs about language that are really powerful, and they're tied to lots of other things, tied to immigration, race, and lots of other things. But here,
I just want to share that we just finished a concert of dance. It was a 120 minutes concert. And my piece at the end, I had 2 guest artists from Mexico. My piece at the end had a 2 minutes dialogue in Spanish. And we received a complaint from a patron saying that they felt discriminated, that they felt that there was nowhere in the program it was indicated that to enjoy the show they had to understand Spanish. This was like 2 minutes of Spanish out of 120 minutes of concert, of dance concert. It's dance on top of it. Like, it's not even like I'm not doing Donkey Shot in Spanish, you know what I'm saying? Like, and they brought up that they felt discriminated. So I think it's important to understand that however we are, UTEP is pushing this message, I think we have to be even more clear. even more consistency. Like, I'm gonna look at the School of Pharmacy, of course, because if it's bilingual, it's built into the mission, that's great. I need to bring it up to my department. But I think there's still a lot of work, even within El Paso, to do. Because if somebody feels entitled to say that they felt discriminated on Black History Month because they couldn't understand 2 minutes of Spanish, we still have a lot of work to do.
Well, and I think probably if we boil it down, so to speak, I think we're looking at not just accepting diversity. So I think it's that wide. I think it's not just accepting it, but embracing diversity. And how do we do that across the university? And I think we're doing a good job, but I think that there's more work to be done. We have to send that message.
Which is why the pharmacy school is interesting to hear it wrapped into, like you pointed out, into the mission. I think you had a hand over here. So.
Yes, I just wanted to also add that even though it's important I speak Spanish, to embrace your language, speaking from experience in the seminars in the PhD, sometimes if the instructor speaks Spanish, I can bring like an example from Mexico relating to the discussion. But I need to consider that there's maybe people from China that will be left out. So it's in my best interest also to translate it or explain what I'm talking about so they don't feel left out from the conversation.
So I think that's a really good point in this sort of how we work with linguistic pluralism in this larger sense. We work with bilingual speakers from lots of different language backgrounds. All right, I think we're going to move on. Okay.
So I think through these conversations, we can see that you're pointing out many of the potential benefits of bilingualism. First, there's mediating factors, right? So I'm going to say a little bit about some of the benefits that have been identified, but keep in mind that there's factors such as race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status that may mediate these factors, right? So these are not, I'm not saying that these are guarantees that there are going to be benefits because there's these other factors. So in the literature it talked about some cognitive advantages, including awareness of what language is, what are the components of language, so phonological awareness, linguistic awareness of syntax and grammar, that bilinguals have higher scores on or higher measures of that compared to monolinguals. Also, in tests of divergent thinking, bilinguals outperform monolinguals, so such as asking a bilingual, giving them some object and saying, what uses can you find for this object? Bilinguals outperform monolinguals. Bilinguals also outperform monolinguals in terms of communicative sensitivity, being aware of who the audience is and what are their needs and how to suit the message to that particular audience. And of course, it won't be surprising, also outperform monolinguals in terms of ability to learn additional language, a third or fourth language. So there's cognitive advantages. And so as educators, I think we can foresee how some of these cognitive advantages are also tied to learning the content, right? So we can think, well, if there's these potential cognitive benefits, how do we create environments in the classroom so that those who are bilinguals can benefit, right? Especially given that the population we serve, first-generation students, working-class students, they may need some of these, can benefit from some of these advantages that maybe they're not currently benefiting from, right? If they're hobbled, right, in the sense that they can only demonstrate what they know in one of their languages, right? There's social advantages. The literature has talked about economic benefits, and we can probably think of locally, if you're bilingual, you can get jobs in serving bilingual clientele here on the border, but then beyond as well. So then particular jobs that are only for students, for people who know more than one language. Potentially also global interaction, so ability to move across borders. We can also easily think of examples of that. And then also social benefits in terms of being aware of what culture, the components of culture and identity and values, so that bilinguals also have been seen to do better or outperform monolinguals. And so I think also there's a lot of connections that you've already brought to what it takes to be a student and some of the advantages that we can potentially leverage to allow students to benefit from those, to reap those potential rewards.
Questions? So we're going to talk about just a handful of sample strategies for working with bilingual students and also English learner students. And then we want to hear from you all because we know there's lots of great ideas and approaches that you all are probably already engaging in your classrooms to work with your students. So that's where we have a lot of expertise in this room and we want to draw on that. So we'll do a kind of a liberating structure technique, if anybody's ever heard of that, to find out some of those. So the first one is learning about our students. So we know that we want to create spaces where our students feel comfortable to learn, they feel safe to learn. We don't want to promote linguistic insecurity where students feel self-conscious about their language. We want to really create the conditions for students to feel secure in expressing themselves linguistically. So one way to do that, sort of a starting point, is by learning about our students. And I included this because this is something that I've started doing in my classes at all levels, is giving a language profile questionnaire at the beginning of the semester. And I do ask their names, but I mean, the only person who receives this information is me, as the instructor, as a faculty member. And then I ask them about their backgrounds. We actually initially used these as part of research projects that we were doing in collaboration between the College of Education and Engineering, and we were learning about engineering students. But then I realized it had a lot of benefits for my own classroom, working with education students. So we asked them how they identify themselves, and then where they attended school, because part of it is about language, and part of it is about where they got their training in terms of K-12. A lot of our students start school in Juarez and then come here in late elementary or middle school. We have 5% of our students who are transferred to Isos border crossers, so they did all of their K-12 schooling in Juarez or in Mexico and are going to university here. And then we have students who did all of their K-12 schooling here, and then we've got lots of variations of that. But it's good to know, or at least for me it's been beneficial to know, where did my students do their schooling, and then in what languages do they feel most comfortable? What do they consider their primary language? What do they use at home? What do they use at UTEP? And so this is just a starting point to get a lay of the land of my classroom and who my students are. And you have a question, go ahead.
Yeah, aren't you worried about any possible legal repercussions of that? Because, I'm in PhD programs, confronted a lot with research and what to do.
Right.
And whenever I'm interviewing someone or asking them for any data that they want to disclose, I have to file with the IRB and
Right. So for classroom purposes, you don't have to file with the IRB if you're just collecting information, but that's a good point that this is not used for any research purposes at all. It's only used for instructional purposes to find out their background. But I think that's a good point about the IRB, because if this were ever to be used for research, we would absolutely have to have their consent. And also we do make it clear, I make it clear that it's voluntary, they do not have to fill this out, but it's for me to learn about them. And so I'm the only person who sees it and nobody else. If that makes sense. But I think that's a great point.
Can I extend that to
Sure.
assessment as well? We don't need IRB approval for the curriculum assessment right in the classroom and using that information?
That's correct. And so this is a tool, and there's other ways of doing it. You may not want to collect a paper or electronic questionnaire. There's ways to do it in the first day of class, finding out about your students and having them talk about their backgrounds, and so you can learn about where they're coming from. So this is just one strategy, but there's lots of ways of learning about students' backgrounds that can be a starting point for designing instruction, and that's the idea. So, second one, writing to learn. Has anyone here heard of writing to learn as a strategy? That's a surprise. Only one person? All right, so writing to learn it's a strategy to get students engaged in informal, ungraded writing about content. So, or about whatever it is that you're teaching. It can be a way to activate prior knowledge. It can be a way for them to reflect on their learning. There's lots of reasons to do it. So what we did at the beginning of the workshop with the index cards, where you wrote about your experiences with bilingual students and why you came to the workshop, that's an example of a writing to learn strategy. So you can do quick writes, you can have your students stop and just write for a minute. But the idea with writing to learn is we know that when students write about content, or when we write, that we have better retention of ideas. So when students have an opportunity to put something in their own words, they're going to remember it better. And that's what we do with Writing to Learn. It's not something that's collected. We're not going to collect these index cards. It's not something that's graded, but it's giving students a chance to write, to make sense of content. And so we can take that to the next level and allow them to do it in their language of choice. So if they want to, if they're trying to figure out a biology concept and they're most comfortable writing in Spanish, giving them the chance to write about that in Spanish can be very effective. So that's just another strategy.
Okay, note taking in preferred language. So it's slightly different from Writing to Learn, because in Writing to Learn you would be writing what you're listening to in your preferred language possibly, and we would not see it. What I started to do this semester in my Intro to Computer Science class is I requested that my students bring notebooks, that they take notes, and I will collect them. So far so good as far as workload, but I think it benefits the student. Now, what I also told them is that they can write in whatever language they want. So this is the iffy point, because I kind of rely on the fact that it's going to be English, Spanish, or French, but I haven't seen that. If there is anything else, I don't know, I might ask for help, because the other reason that I collect their notebooks is to see if they have organized notes that they can use later, if they are making sense of what we're talking about in the classroom, and also if there is any error, I should be able to convey that to us to correct some misunderstanding. So far it's always been in a language that I can understand, and I insist on this. I'll keep doing this. If it's going to be on me, I'll find someone who speaks the language that I don't speak if this happens. But that's something I wanted to share with my students. I was telling them, this is a safe place, you can write in whatever language you want. I'm forcing you to have a notebook, but beyond this, I'm not forcing you to, a special language. Because I take notes in different languages, and I can't tell you why, so it depends. I don't know what happens, I just switch. Also, what I asked them, what I told them that they could do, and I did it myself, so that they would show me doing it, is in computer science, we write code, we write programs. That's not all that we do, but they happen to have to write code. So I told them that they can write part of the code in their preferred language. So of course, code is coded. So there are a lot of words in their code that they cannot change. And they are usually in English. But there are all sorts of words that they can use to describe what they do, the functionalities that they develop, the memory that they use. They can name them, and I encourage them to use their own language. So it's a little bit limited if, there is no other computer scientist here, but if you know a little bit of programming, you know that it's probably better if you use names or words that you can share with others eventually, because coding is not done just by yourself. So in this regard, it's going to be, it's not going to work on the long term. But for now, since it's Intro to Computer Science, I wanted to ease them on this end and say, you can feel safe with your code. If it makes more sense to you to write it in this other language, fine. And I told them, and I will even learn new words from you, so this is great. And then I put words in my slides of code with names in French so that they could see something else. So it brings different levels of conversation, and really it's in the fashion of building this safe place where we encourage and we embrace their differences. So that's that.
And very related to this idea of writing to learn or note-taking is using students' full range of semiotic abilities, right? So meaning-making abilities. So we know that language is one of our meaning-making resources, but it's not the only one, right? So we also use gestures to communicate, drawings, images, charts. So if you see here, this is something that it's a Venn diagram, a particular kind of, it's from, I did it, it's not from my classroom, it's from, I got it from the internet, but I thought it was interesting that it's a Venn diagram, but it's also a multilingual, right? And so if you consider what Erika was saying, right, so then writing to learn, writing that's done for students learning, then creating images can be potentially use semiotic resources to create meaning, to learn, right? So we learn as a way to make sense, right? And so engaging the full range of semiotic resources is a way to recognize that language is one of the resources we have, not the only one, right? And so this is something that you can I can do with adults, right? So students in the undergraduate classroom, create an image to represent a concept, and then maybe explain what it means to them. So you can consider language within a universe of things that people do, that humans do to communicate, to make sense.
So now what we're going to do, so we just gave some examples from our own classrooms of what we do with students, but we know there's a lot more out there. So what we'd like you to do now, I know the print here is pretty small, and I don't think we're going to be able to do this entire thing because we're getting towards 1:30, but at least get started with what we'd like you to do is interview one another in pairs. I don't think we're going to be able to do, so has anyone heard of appreciative interviewing? This is a liberating structure. Has any of you who have attended those workshops, which are fantastic kinds of group and cooperative learning strategies. So the idea is you interview, there's a partner, a pair that interviews one another, and then you go into a group of 4, you retell what your partner said to the group of 4, and then you look for patterns across. I don't think we're going to be able to do that. I think we're just going to be able to do the pairs right now. But what we'd like you to talk about is what you already do to support bilingual learners in your classroom. We know there's, again, a lot of good stuff going on. And then how you can create a classroom environment that allows students to use all of these resources that we're talking about, these linguistic resources, and then any challenges that you faced or might face in doing this. So if you could do that with your pairs, and then we'll just report back. I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to go through the whole thing, but we had a great discussion earlier, so it's a trade-off. So why don't we do that 2 minutes per person, 4 minutes total, and then we'll share with a large group. And then we're just going to start to wrap up as well. So,
and I was just sharing with Victoria that in my case it's complicated to apply bilingualism because my job is, I guess, to promote English and promote that they have the skills, oral and written. Like in most cases scenario, 99% of my students are native speakers of Spanish. 1% can be, Asian or any other place. And so that also, it's another reason why, I guess I should not allow them to speak in their native language, which that's what the tendency is. They like to speak Spanish all the time. And so I guess this is one case that you would say I cannot apply bilingualism.
Well, maybe, but how do you support bilingual learners? I bet you have a lot to share on how you support them. Even if the goal is getting to English, there's lots of ways that you support them, whether they're bilingual in Mandarin or Spanish, right?
I guess one way I can support their, the bilingualism is allowing them to look for resources in their native language. But then when it comes, for them to turn on their essays, then I really, I say you need to do this in English for me. But then, keep in mind that you might have to do some translation there. Right. So I guess that's the way.
Another thing that comes to mind is that I have a background also of teaching ESL. So then one of the things that was very interesting to me to learn is that, well, we're always making connections between our languages, right? So then these adult learners probably have some knowledge about what a composition is. And the conventions might be different in English. So maybe working with them to identify how they're comparing, contrasting, right? What are the conventions in Spanish, what are the conventions in English, and what can I observe in this model of a composition to reach that model or that standard that you want to reach.
I was talking to Diane about what she does in the classroom, and she has worked a lot on her Spanish. She doesn't feel like she's completely fluent, but she, as a way to connect with her students and try to show them that while I'm trying to speak, not maybe Spanish here just because it's the dominant second language of our community, but I think it gives a confidence to students to see you not only trying to learn a language like Martine does with the notebook thing that you were explaining, that you value the language that they speak, and that speaking more than one language is something valuable. And I think that can bring a lot of confidence to students.
Yeah, but the last thing we'd like you to do on your way out is fill out an exit ticket where you tell us a takeaway, positive or negative, from today's workshop. It could be, something that you've learned, something you want to critique, and then one question or concern that you have about what we talked about during the past 90 minutes.